In the name of God, happy new school year, dear students. I wish all the best for you and for family. We will read about typology from different sources like different book and different article. At first I want to start from this book, which is Typology and Universals from William Croft, which is one of the famous person in typology. We will read just some of these chapters. I will go to the first chapter. Okay. About the typology here in this session, we will read different definition of typology from different viewpoint. They define the typology, which we expect you to know all of this definition because the function of typology will be different based on this definition. What is typology? As you know, your final exam is multiple choice and you should know all of this definition. The term typology has a number of different uses, both within linguistics and without. It means that typology has linguistic definition and typology has another definition in another field. The common definition of the term is roughly synonymous with taxonomy or classification. For example, a classification of the phenomenon under study into types, particularly structural types. Okay, one of the common definition of typology which is common in linguistic and other fields like biology and other fields, means taxonomy or classification. The taxonomy or classification of phenomena under the study into types, particularly structural types. It is one of the definition of typology which is so common. This is the definition that is found outside of linguistic. For example, in biology, a field that inspired linguistic theory in the 19th century. Okay. The common definition of typology outside of linguistics, but in linguistics we can see such a classification, but this definition is not very common in linguistics. Therefore, in the field like biology and other fields outside of the linguistics, typology is famous for taxonomy or classification of the types. This is one of the definition of typology which is common outside of the linguistics. The most unassuming linguistic definition of typology here, we will read about the typology in linguistic. The most unassuming linguistic definition of typology refers to a classification of structural types across languages. Here I told you that classification is also common in linguistics, but not like other fields. Here we know typology in linguistics as the classification of structural types across languages. A classification of structural types across languages. Okay. In this definition, dear student, you should know all of the details about this definition. All of them are important. And typology is one of the very important lesson. In this definition, a language is taken to belong to a single type, and a typology of languages is a definition of the types and an enumeration or classification of languages into those types. This is the classification or the meaning of typology in linguistics, which they classify the languages across all of the languages under the different types. We will refer to this definition of typology as typological classification. Dear student, maybe I ask you about the typological classification. You should know that this is the definition of typological classification, or maybe I give you this definition and I want you to find its correct term, which is typological classification. The morphological typology of the 19th and early 20th centuries is an example of this use of the term. Okay, this type of term, this function of typology is common in 19th century and the early of 20th centuries. This definition introduces the basic connotation that the term typology has in contemporary linguistics. Typology has to do with cross-linguistic comparison of some sort. This is the summarization of this definition, which is very important here. Typology has to do with cross-linguistic comparison of some sort. This is the important function of typology. Cross-linguistic comparison of some sort. You should know that. Methodological issues in cross-linguistic comparison will be discussed in this part. And in chapter 2 will be devoted to the notion of the linguistic type, including morphological typology and its refinements in 20th century research. A second linguistic definition. You should know that definition. You should know that this kind of definition was common in 19th century and the early of 20th century, and you should know its function. A second linguistic definition of typology is the study of patterns. Is the study of patterns that occur systematically across languages. Okay, this is another definition of typology. A second linguistic definition, dear student, is the linguistic definition of typology, not common definition of typology. Linguistic definition of typology is the study of patterns that occur systematically across languages. The patterns found in typological generalization are language universals. You should know all of them. I want to repeat it again. A second linguistic definition of typology is the study of patterns that occur systematically across languages. A study of patterns that occur systematically across languages. We will refer to this definition of typology as typological generalization, which this is the definition of typological generalization. The patterns found in typological generalization are language universals. All of them are important. The classic example of a typological universal is the implicational universal. The classic example of a typological universal is the implicational universal. An example of an implicational universal is the generalization. Here, dear student, we give you another definition of typology, which was the typological generalization, which Here we find the patterns that occur systematically across languages, which is common and shared between the languages of the world, which we call these patterns in typological generalization as language universal. And the example of typological universal is implicational universal. One of the example of implicational universal is in this way. Dear student, we have so many implicational universal, which Greenberg mentioned them, but here we read one of them. It means that these implicational universal are shared in all of the languages. It means that if the first part of this implicational universal occur in one language, then the second part will occur in that language. If the demonstrative follows the head noun, it means that in those languages which this is common, it means that in the languages which we have the demonstrative which follows with the head noun, then certainly the relative clause also follows the head noun. It is one of the implicational universal. If the demonstrative follows the head noun, then the relative clause also follows the head noun. It means that if you find a language which the head noun follows the demonstrative, certainly in that language the relative clause follows the head noun. Maybe some language we expect that this will be shared in all of the language because they are language universal, but maybe in some language they don't exist. This universal cannot be discovered or verified by observing only a single language, dear students, such as English. We will read so many languages to find this universal. One has to do a general survey of languages to observe that the language type excluded by the implicational universal. Maybe some languages excluded this, some of this implicational universal, namely a language in which the demonstrative follows the head noun and the relative clause preceded it. Such a language based on this implicational indeed doesn't exist, because it is not based on this implicational typology. Typological generalization is generally regarded as a subdiscipline of linguistics, not unlike, say, first language acquisition, with a particular domain of linguistic facts to examine. Cross-linguistic patterns. This is the function of typological generalization. Cross-linguistic patterns. We find the cross-linguistic patterns. Typology, in this sense, began in earnest with Joseph Greenberg's discovery of implicational universal of morphology and word order, first presented in 1960. Dear student, Joseph Greenberg was the first person who found the implicational typology, the implicational universals, and defined them and introduced them, which his first implicational universal were concerned with morphology and word order, which they were mentioned in 1960. The primary purpose of the present volume is to discuss the kinds of cross-linguistic patterns that have been discovered and the methodological and empirical issues raised by the study of these patterns. Dear student, you as a researcher, you can find maybe some person did it before you. Find this implicational universal in your language. Maybe some of them exist in your language, and maybe in, for example, in Arabic we don't have such a implicational universal. Okay. Chapters 3 to 7 are devoted to discussing these patterns and the empirical and methodological issues that their discovery raises. The kind of cross-linguistic patterns actually found represent a coherent set of language universal, which are basic phenomena to be explained by any linguistic theory. That was the second definition of typology. Here we have the third definition and the final linguistic definition of typology, which is, in this sense, typology represents an approach or theoretical framework to the study of language that contrasts with prior approaches, such as American structuralism and generative grammar. In this definition, typology is an approach to linguistic theorizing, or more precisely, a methodology of linguistic analysis that gives rise to different kinds of linguistic theories than found in other approaches. Sometimes this view of typology is called the Greenbergian as opposed to the Chomskyan approach to linguistic theory after the best-known practitioners like Smith, 1982. This view of typology is closely allied to functionalism. This definition of typology is concerned and is like the functionalism. The view that linguistic structure should be explained primarily in terms of linguistic function, which the Chomskyan approach is contrastively titled formalism. For this reason, typology in this sense is often called functional typological approach. In the another definition we have functional typological approach and will be called so here. More precisely, we may characterize this definition of typology as functional typological explanation. The functional typological approach became generally recognized in 1917. Important figures beginning at the time include Gibbon, Hammond, Comrie, Hopper, and Thompson. Functional typological explanation has well-established historical antecedent, however not least Greenberg himself. The three linguistic definition of here, dear student, in this paragraph, we will read the summarization of these three definitions. The three linguistic definitions of typology correspond to the three stages of any empirical scientific analysis. Typological classification represents the observation of an empirical phenomena or language and classification of what we observe. Typological generalization, language universals, is the formation of generalization over our observation. In the functional typological approach, construct explanation of the generalization over what we have observed. In this sense, typology represents an empirical scientific approach to the study of language. Of course, in any empirical science, the actual process of doing science doesn't proceed in these three discrete stages. In particular, explanation effort themselves at all stages in the scientific process. We will present typological explanation of language universals as the universals themselves are introduced in chapter 3 to 7. The explanatory models used by typologists include competing motivation, dear student. They are very important and we will read about them in details in the next chapters. The explanatory models used by typologists include competing motivation, we will read about them. Economy, iconicity, processing, semantic maps, and conceptual space, and a rethinking of syntactic argumentation. One significant dimension of typological explanation is that explanation of many grammatical phenomena are fundamentally diachronic, not synchronic. The diachronic approach requires a fundamental rethinking of typology principles and is discussed in Chapter 8. Chapter 9 then summarizes the approach to language that typology presents. Not surprisingly, these differing definitions of typology, typological classification, typological generalization, and functional typological explanation approach. Here, again, we mentioned the three linguistic definitions of typology, which these differing definitions of typology, typological classification, typological generalization, and functional typological explanation approach have led to some confusion about what typology is or is supposed to be. For example, it is sometimes claimed that typology is merely descriptive or taxonomic. That is to say, it doesn't provide a means for developing a series of language which can function as an alternative to, for example, generative linguistic theory. This represents a confusion of typological classification with typological generalization and explanation. Typological generalization represents, here we have a summarization of these three definitions, which it is sometimes claimed that typology is merely descriptive or taxonomic. That is to say, it doesn't provide a means for developing series of language which can function as an alternative to, for example, generative linguistic theory. This represents a confusion of typological classification with typological generalization and explanation. Typological generalization represents a well-established method of analysis, and the typological approach is now a well-articulated approach to language. The emphasis on theory and methodology in this volume should not be interpreted as minimizing the descriptive work necessary to develop typological analysis. The descriptive work, which has been and I hope will continue to be done on the tremendous number of languages in the world, is absolutely essential not just to typological theory but to all linguistic theories. Unfortunately, typological studies have often had to withhold or remove their data sections upon publication due to size limitation. While many good descriptive works, such as the University of Hawaii Press policies of Micronesian language grammar, rapidly go out of print. The attitude that descriptive work is not valued, it is merely descriptive or disparagingly descriptivist, must be abandoned for there to be progress in the linguistic theory. This matter becomes even more urgent because of the alarming loss of the empirical data base for linguistic theory. Hundreds of languages have become extinct in the last century. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of others no longer survive in viable speech communities. The languages are dying, and there are often serious consequences affecting grammatical structure. The situation is getting worse, not better, and is finally achieving the attention it deserves. The empirical problems with language research parallel the problems in biological research, in particular in evolutionary theory and ecology. The extinction of languages and the loss of the linguistic communities is like the extinction of species and the loss of their habitat or ecosystems. In both disciplines, it threatens theoretical progress. Dear student, we read about typology in a different viewpoint. We defined typology in outside of the linguistic. which was common in another field like biology, which was concerned with taxonomy. We gave you the definition of typology, taxonomic typology or classification typology, and generalization typology and functional typology, which we expect you know about them. We want you to define them in details, and you should know the function of these three definitions. Here we will read more about typology, universals, and generative grammar in details. Typology, universals, and generative grammar. Here in this section, we give you more details about these terms. Greenberg's approach to language universals emerged at about the same time as Chomsky's in the late 1950s. The conception of language universals in typology and generative grammar is quite different. You should know that, dear students, you should know their differences. The conception of language universals, as you know, we have in generative grammar we have universal too, but these terms, language universals in generative grammar and in typology, are different from each other. In this section, we will briefly describe the emergence of Greenberg's and Chomsky's ideas and the similarities and differences that are found in the two approaches to language. We will return to the relationship between typology and generative grammar in later chapters in the context of more specific theoretical issues. Language universals reflect the belief that there exist linguistic properties beyond the essential definitional properties of language that hold for all languages. Okay, this is the meaning of universal. By universal, we mean that they are shared in all of the languages. Also, this belief has considerable modern currency. It is by no means a necessary fact or universally held opinion, and in fact, the positive view was widely held until around 1960. To a considerable degree, the difference between the generative and typological approaches to language universal can be traced to different traditions to which Chomsky and Greenberg responded. The generative approach represents a reaction against behavioristic psychology. Here we told you that the concept of universal linguistic universal is different in generative approach and in typology, which in generative approach the definition and the concept of universal represent a reaction against the behavioristic psychology, while the typological approach represents a reaction against anthropological relativism. Both of them are different from each other because they react to different matters. Here we will read their details. The behaviorist view of language, in particular language learning, is anti-universalist in that it posits no innate, universal internal mental abilities or schemas. This is the idea of behaviorism. In this behaviorist view, linguistic competence is acquired through learning of a stimulus-response pattern. In contrast, the generative approach posits the existence of innate internal linguistic abilities and constraints that play a major role in the acquisition of language. It is these constraints that represent linguistic universals in this approach. The argument used by Chomsky for the existence of innate universal linguistic competence refers to the poverty of the stimulus. You know about that, you read about that in a syntax maybe. Linguists agreed that the child has an extremely limited input stimulus, that is, the utterances that it is exposed to from the mother and the other caregivers. This stimulus is incapable of permitting the child to construct the grammar of the adult's language in a classic behaviorist model. Therefore, the child must bring innate universals of grammatical competence to bear on language acquisition. Hence, the primary focus on universals in the generative tradition has been under innate character. The anthropological relativist view of language is that the languages of the world can vary arbitrarily. Languages could differ from each other without limit and in unpredictable way. In Martin Jo's famous passage, this view of language was particularly strong among anthropological linguists studying North American Indian languages, which indeed differ radically in many ways from so-called standard average European languages. However, the comparison of one exotic language or a limited number of languages to English only indicate diversity, not the range of variation, let alone limits thereto. Greenberg and others discovered that a more systematic sampling of a substantial number of languages reveal not only the range of variation but constraints on that variation. Those constraints demonstrate that languages don't vary infinitely, and the constraints represent linguistic universals. Hence, the primary focus on universal in the typological tradition has been under cross-linguistic validity and on universal that restrict possible language variation. Here we read the ideas of behaviorists and anthropology. Anthropologists, and we know that the universal of typology and universal in generative grammar are the reaction to these two ideas. The innate universal posited by generative grammar are intended to explain linguistic structure. The poverty of the stimulus argument is essentially a deductive argument from first principle. Although it does make assumptions about the nature of the empirical input and what counts as relevant input. The poverty of the stimulus argument is one aspect of Chomsky's more generally rationalist approach to language. The universal posited by typology are intended to represent inductive generalization across languages, in keeping with typology's empiricist approach to language. Typological universal call for explanation in terms of more general cognitive, social, interactional, processing, perceptual, or other abilities. These abilities may also be innate, but they extend beyond language pursuit. The generative grammarian argues that this discovery of innate principles that the child brings to bear in learning a single language can be extrapolated to language in general. The typologist argues that grammatical analysis based on one language or a small number of languages will not suffice to reveal linguistic universals unless systematic empirical survey can do so. These differences in approach have led to claim that the Greenbergian approach and the Chomskyan approach to language universals and linguistic explanation are diametrically opposed to each other. In fact, there are significant similarities between the generative and functional typological approaches. Both approaches begin with the analysis of language structure. This is the shared point between them. Both approaches begin with the analysis of language structure. Both approaches consider the central question of linguistics to be what is a possible human language. Both approaches are universalist. In contrast to their predecessors, there is a broad agreement that there do exist a substantial number of universals that hold of all languages. Here we have the shared feature between these two types of universal. For both approaches, the construction of linguistic generalization involves abstraction over the data, though the Greenbergian abstracts pattern across languages and the Chomskyan abstract patterns within languages. Okay, the Greenbergian patterns are across languages, but the Chomskyan abstract patterns are within the languages. Likewise, explanation for linguistic universals rest on universal human abilities which may or may not be language specific and which probably have a significant innate component, though perhaps are not entirely innate. In fact, through both generative and typological approaches, the foundation of linguistic explanation are ultimately biological, although for the Chomskyan, the biological basis is found in genetics, innate linguistic knowledge, and for Greenbergian, the biological basis in indirect, and is to be found in evolutionary theory. Nevertheless, there are two salient distinctive characteristics of the Greenbergian approach: the central rule of cross-linguistic comparison and the close relationship between linguistic form and the linguistic function. These two characteristics are discussed in the following two sections. Okay, in the following and in the next session, we will read about these two points. Dear student, we are forced to read and we teach you line by line because we want you to learn them and we want you to know them for your final exam, and you should learn all of these details, and we're forced to teach you line by line. In this session, we gave you the definition of typology. I want to review the matter of this session, the important matter of this session, which you should know them. And you should summarize them for your task. Please, in your summarization, you point the important matters, not the details. Your summarization, as you know, and is common for you, you should summarize this, for example, this session in maximum in 2 pages, not more. And just mention the important and the important matters and the important terms, and give a short definition for that. For this session, you should summarize these important matters which we taught you, like the definition of typology with outside of the language and outside of the linguistic, and you should be able to define the three linguistic definition of typology which is common in linguistic, like typological classification. You should know about that. You should give a short definition for the typological classification in your summarization. Typological generalization, you should know about the universal, the definition of typological generalization, and the implicational universal. You should know that it was Greenberg which for the first time defined the implicational universal, which most of them were about the morphology or word order. Here we had one example of that. Maybe I give you this example for a final exam and ask you about the type of this typology, which is implicational universal. And we told you about this Greenbergian implicational universal, And here we had a third definition of typology in linguistics, which was functional typological approach. You should know that. And here we had its detail. Here we told you that for doing the typology we need empirical data of language, which the number of them is very important, but because of the limitation we have, we delete some of these matters. And then we give some information about these terms: typology, universal and generative grammar. Here we told you that the concept of universal is different in Greenberg's and Chomsky viewpoint, because both of them use this term to react to different matters. Greenberg do that to answer and to react to anthropologies, but Chomsky do that to answer to behaviorism. Here we read about these two concepts, these two viewpoints, and we give you information about the universals in Greenberg terms and in Chomsky terms. Just for this session, you should define the typology outside of linguistic, the three definitions of typology in linguistic, and you should give the short definition for them. Then you should define the universals based on Chomsky viewpoint and Greenberg viewpoint. And in this paragraph we give you the shared points and shared matters in Chomsky and Greenberg's. You should know all of them for a final exam, and you should summarize them. You can summarize this session in just maximum in 2 pages, not more. And you should upload your summarization just on model system. Okay, dear student, please look at this video. I will give you I will upload the booklet of this session too. Sometimes it needs to read this booklet by yourself to find the important matters, and you should look to this video. Sometimes it needs to do that 2 or 3 times to get the point, and you need to read the booklet by yourself and ask your questions through WhatsApp, please, and please upload your task in the time which we determine for you. Thank you.